button raises. You're in the big blind. You call. The flop comes down and you check. The button bets. And without really thinking about it, you call again. That pattern right there, check, call, is costing you money every single session. Not because calling is always wrong, but because when it becomes your default, your autopilot, the thing you do when you don't have a clear plan, you hand control of the hand to the aggressor, and you never take it back. You become reactive, predictable, easy to play against. The strongest big blind players in 2026 do something different. When they check, it's not always an invitation for you to bet and take control. Sometimes it's a trap, a setup. The first half of a move that completely changes who's driving the hand. They check, you bet. And then they come back over the top of you with a raise that puts the entire decision tree back in your lap. The check raise. It's not a new move. Every experienced player knows what it is. But the way top players are deploying it today, the frequency, the sizing, the specific board textures they're targeting, that's where the real evolution is happening. And most players at mid-stakes are still years behind this curve, which means every time they face a good big blind player, they're navigating a weapon they don't fully understand. This video is about building that understanding from the ground up, not in a theoretical solver dump kind of way, in the way an experienced grinder actually thinks about it at the table, with texture reads, psychological awareness, and a practical framework you can apply in your next session. By the end of this, you're going to see the big blind differently, not as the position you're always defending from, as the position where, when you're ready, you go on offense. And the first thing to understand is exactly why you've been losing money in this spot without realizing it. The big blind is the most attacked position in poker. That's not an opinion. It's a mathematical and structural reality that every serious player needs to fully internalize. Because until you do, you'll keep responding to that pressure with strategies that are fundamentally insufficient. Here's the structure. Every player at the table who opens a hand is doing so from a position that has the option to act last on every street after the flop. They have information leverage on every single decision that follows. You, in the big blind, have already committed chips to the pot before seeing your cards. You're playing from behind before the hand even starts. And because you've invested one big blind, you're getting pot odds that make calling profitable across a very wide range of holdings, which means you're going to the flop with a lot of hands that have real equity, but real vulnerability. Every aggressive player at the table knows this. The button knows it. The cutoff knows it. Even the under-the-gun player who opens tight knows that when the action folds to the big blind, the player there is the most likely to defend with a wide, somewhat capped range, and they price their bets accordingly. What this creates over hundreds of sessions is a structural leak that most players never fully diagnose. They defend correctly pre-flop. They're not folding too much to steals. But then on the flop, facing a continuation bet from a player who has position, initiative, and a tighter pre-flop range, they default to passive play. They check call. They do it on the turn, sometimes on the river, and by the end of the hand, they've spent 3 streets of chips in a pot they had no real influence over, against a range that was ahead of them most of the way. Passive defense in the big blind is a slow bleed. It's not dramatic. No single hand feels catastrophic. But across a full session, across a week, across a month, the cumulative cost of constantly ceding initiative in your most disadvantaged position adds up to a number that would shock most players if they pulled it from their tracking software. The aggressor doesn't need to have the best hand to beat you this way. They just need you to keep letting them steer. And most players do. But here's the thing. The check raise doesn't just stop the bleed. It reverses it entirely. And the reason most players underuse it is not lack of knowledge. It's a specific psychological resistance that we're going to dismantle piece by piece. Let's talk about what actually happens to your range when you check call too much. Because this is where the damage goes beyond just the chips you're losing in individual pots. This is where your entire game strategy starts to erode in ways you might not even notice until you're already deep in a losing pattern. When you check call a flop bet, you do 2 things simultaneously. First, you continue in the hand, which is sometimes correct. Second, you tell the aggressor something very specific about your range. It doesn't contain the hands strong enough to check raise. Your continuing range, by definition, is capped at some threshold below the check raise region. The aggressor now knows that when they bet the turn, they are not facing the strongest hands in your original big blind defending range. Those would have check raised. This capping effect compounds across streets. By the time you reach the river as a check caller, the aggressor has been pricing their bets against a range they understand to be bounded. They know you don't have the nuts. They know you don't have the two pair they'd be worried about on a specific texture. They can bet more aggressively, bet larger, and apply maximum pressure precisely because they've read your passive line correctly. Think about what this means from the aggressor's perspective. If they know you check raise at appropriate frequency, they have to account for that range on every flop they bet. They can't simply fire any two cards into you and expect a predictable result. The threat of the check raise forces them to assign probability to scenarios where you have strong hands, where you have draws that are going to fight back, where continuing to barrel is going to cost them significantly. That threat changes how they bet. It changes what sizing they choose. It changes whether they continuation bet at all. Now remove that threat. Give them a big blind player who almost never check raises. Suddenly, every single flop becomes a simple decision for them. Bet, take the initiative, let the range advantage and position do the work. They don't need to think hard. They don't need to be careful. They just bet until you fold or call your way to a showdown they're favored to win. This is why passive defense is not just a leak in specific hands. It's a strategic concession that makes you easier to play against across the entire session. And the players who understand this most deeply are the ones who have made the check raise not an occasional surprise, but a regular part of their big blind toolkit. The real question is not whether to check raise more. It's when and at what size. And that's where the modern game gets interesting. Something has shifted in the way elite players use check raises in 2026. And if you've been playing against strong regs and wondering why certain big blind players feel different, harder to read, harder to bet into, harder to predict, this is a large part of the answer. The older model of check raising was relatively polarized. You check raised with your strongest made hands to build the pot, and occasionally with a big combo draw to balance. The bet call range was everything in the middle. It was a move that announced strength, and experienced players learned to read it accordingly. When someone check raised in a passive pool, you could narrow their range significantly. What's happening now is that the better players have expanded the check raise range in ways that make it much harder to read. They're check raising at higher frequencies. They're using smaller raise sizes on specific textures that keep the pot manageable while still taking the initiative. And they're doing it with a wider variety of hand types, not just the monster hands and the obvious big draws, but top pairs on certain boards, middle pairs with backdoor draws, hands that have real equity but aren't strong enough to be pure value. The result is a check raise range that is genuinely difficult to put on a narrow category. Why smaller sizing? Because one of the old objections to check raising was stack depth. A big check raise commits too many chips with a draw, and if you get 4-bet, you're often in a tough spot. The smaller check raise, typically to around 2.5 to 3 times the continuation bet, accomplishes the same initiative taking and range protection goals while keeping the stack depth intact for future streets. It also looks different from the traditional polarized check raise, which adds to the confusion it creates. There's also a board texture component that's become much more refined. The best players today are identifying specific flop textures where the big blind has a genuine range advantage, where the calling range connects better with the flop than the opening range typically does, and they're attacking those textures with check raises far more aggressively than the average player. If you're not doing this, you're leaving significant money on the table against good players, and you're also missing the specific spots where this weapon works so well it almost feels unfair. The next section is where we get specific about exactly those spots and why they work so well. Not all check raises are created equal. The move has the most power on specific board textures, and learning to identify those textures quickly is the difference between a well-timed weapon and an expensive mistake. The first category is draw-heavy boards. Think two-tone flops with connected cards, 8-7-6 with 2 hearts, 9-8-5 rainbow, Jack-10-4 with a flush draw. On boards like these, the big blind's calling range has natural connections. You called from the big blind with suited connectors, with pairs, with suited broadways, with hands that hit these textures hard. The aggressor's opening range, especially from the button or cutoff, is more weighted toward high card value hands that may have less direct connection to the texture. When you check raise draw heavy boards from the big blind, you're representing a range that makes complete sense on the texture. You could have the straight, the draw, The two pair the set. The aggressor has to account for all of it. And even if you're check-raising with a draw or a semi-bluff, the range protection provided by the texture makes the move hard to exploit. The second category is paired boards. A flop like 8-3 or 6-6 queen creates an interesting dynamic. Most opening ranges don't contain many 8s or 6s. The big blind's wider pre-flop range does. You called with pocket 3s, with 7-8 suited, with hands that can spike trips on paired low boards. Check-raising a paired board from the big blind tells a story the aggressor can't easily dismiss. The third category, and this is the one most players miss, is boards where the big blind specifically has the nut advantage. What does that mean? It means you're on a texture where the strongest possible hands, the sets, the straights, the flushes, are more likely to be in the big blind defending range than in the aggressor's opening range. When you have the nut advantage on a board, check-raising is not just a tactical play, it's a structural advantage. But here's the thing about board texture reads. Knowing which textures favor the check-raise is only half the equation. The other half is knowing what hands to do it with. And this is where the psychology really starts. The hands you choose to check-raise with matter as much as the timing. A check-raise with the wrong hand on the right board still costs you chips. A check-raise with the right hand on the wrong board is equally expensive. The combination of hand strength and board texture is what makes the move actually work. Let's start with the clearest category. Strong draws. A flush draw with two overcards on a connected board is a classic check-raise candidate. You have significant equity, often 35 to 45%, depending on the specifics, and you benefit from fold equity that the check-raise creates. If you can get the aggressor to fold and take the pot now, great. If they call, you have a real chance of winning at showdown. The combination of those two equity streams makes the semi-bluff check-raise with strong draws one of the highest EV plays available in this spot. Combo draws take this even further. Imagine you have a straight draw and a flush draw simultaneously on a wet board. You might be a genuine favorite against the aggressor's continuation betting range when you account for all your outs. Check-raising with a combo draw is not a bluff. It's often a value play in disguise. Top pair with backdoor draws is the category that surprises players the most when they first encounter it. You have top pair, a kicker, plus a flush or backdoor straight draw. The hand is strong enough to be uncomfortable folding, but it's also vulnerable to being outdrawn on a wet board. Check-raising with this hand accomplishes two things simultaneously. It builds the pot when you're likely ahead, and it creates fold equity that protects you from the cards that could overtake you. Semi-bluffs with specific outs round out the range. Middle pair with a gut shot. Bottom two pair on a board where your value is real but fragile. Hands that benefit from taking initiative rather than calling down three streets. The thread connecting all of these is equity. You are not check-raising with nothing. You are check-raising with hands that have real reasons to be in the pot and real benefits from taking control. And this is where most players make the exact mistake we're about to talk about. Because the same move that builds these hands into weapons can completely destroy your stack when used carelessly. Let's talk about what actually happens in the mind of an experienced aggressor when they run a continuation bet into a check-raise. Because this psychological dimension is something most strategy content ignores, and it's one of the reasons this move is so effective against good players, not just against weak ones. The experienced button player has a routine when they raise pre-flop and get called by the big blind. They see the flop. They assess their equity and range advantage, they select a sizing, and they fire. This is a familiar, comfortable sequence. They've done it thousands of times. It's automatic. They're in control. Then you check-raise. And here's what immediately happens. The comfort disappears. The automatic routine breaks. They are now forced to make a real decision in a situation where they don't have complete information. They have to ask themselves, what does this player have? Are they check-raising a set? A draw? Are they defending their range on this texture specifically? Is this a well-timed bluff, or am I walking into a trap? These questions are not trivial. Even an experienced player needs to work through them. And while they're working through them, something else is happening that is less analytical and more emotional. They've lost the sense of being in control of the hand. They were the aggressor. They had initiative. Now they're the one responding. And the person who was supposed to be playing defense has turned around and started applying pressure. This discomfort frequently produces mistakes. The aggressor might fold a hand that had significant equity against your check-raise range, because the psychological pressure of the situation tips them toward caution. Or they might 3-bet too aggressively, turning a made hand into a bluff-catcher situation because their competitive instinct resists being check-raised. Both responses benefit you. Against recreational players, the effect is even more pronounced. The check-raise from someone who was supposed to be the passive, positionally disadvantaged player reads as strength, often as maximum strength, and the recreational tendency to avoid confrontation with perceived strength leads to folds at far higher frequencies than the equity of the situation would justify. You are not just playing cards when you check-raise. You are playing the person on the other side of the table, and the psychological leverage of this move is a significant part of its total value. But there's a critical mistake that even players who understand all of this still make, and it might be the one thing keeping your check-raise game from being truly dangerous. The check-raise is a powerful weapon. It is not an invincible one, and the players who overuse it or misuse it end up in a worse position than the players who never use it at all, because the mistakes are more expensive and more visible. The first and most common mistake is using the check-raise too frequently on the wrong boards. If you're check-raising every time the button continuation bets, experienced players will start to adjust. They'll widen the hands they're willing to get involved with after your check-raise, because they've correctly identified that your check-raise range is too wide to all be strong. The move works precisely because it's unexpected and targeted. When it becomes a pattern, it loses that quality. The second mistake is check-raising with too little equity. Checking and raising with a hand that has almost no chance of winning at showdown, no draw, no pair, no real backdoor outs, is a pure bluff that requires the aggressor to fold more than the pot odds demand. Against thinking players who understand that the big blind shouldn't always have a strong hand when they check-raise, these pure bluffs get called and 3-bet with uncomfortable regularity. You need equity to support the move. Semi-bluffs work. Pure air usually doesn't. The third mistake is sizing errors. The check-raise that's too large commits too many chips without enough equity to justify it. The check-raise that's too small doesn't apply enough pressure to generate meaningful fold equity. The sizing needs to be calibrated to the specific situation, the stack depth, the board texture, the sizing of the original continuation bet, and the type of player you're targeting. The fourth mistake is misreading the aggressor's tendencies. Not all continuation bettors are the same. Some players bet continuation bets at high frequency with weak hands that fold easily. Others bet a tighter, more value-heavy range that doesn't fold to check raises as readily. Your check raise frequency and the hands you choose to do it with should be adjusted based on how the specific aggressor at your table is betting. Getting these 4 things right is the difference between a check raise that damages your chips and one that adds to your stack. And there's a practical framework that makes it much easier to navigate in real time. Before we get into the framework, I want to take a moment to point you towards something that goes significantly deeper than any single video can. If this kind of thinking, range analysis, board texture reads, the psychology of aggression, the discipline of using the right weapon at the right moment, resonates with you, the channel has built something for exactly this kind of player. We've released a full collection of 10 poker books, all available on Amazon now. These aren't surface-level guides. They cover the actual thinking process of winning players across every dimension of the game. The collection includes a book on poker math that makes advanced concepts genuinely intuitive, a deep dive into controlled aggression using 3 bets and 4 bets and all-ins, work on the mental traps that keep good players stuck at the same stakes, frameworks for understanding variance and building the long-term orientation that serious players need, and much more across the full 10 titles. Years of knowledge, condensed into practical systems. Not theory for the sake of theory. Tools that shorten your learning curve and give you frameworks you can apply the next time you sit down. All the links are in the pinned comment right now. Take 30 seconds after this video, go to the pinned comment, and check out what applies to where your game is today. If you're watching a video about check raises and big blind strategy, at least one of these books is going to be immediately relevant to your development. Now, the framework. This is the part that takes everything we've discussed and makes it actually usable in real time, under real pressure, at a real table. The practical framework for using check raises from the big blind is built on 3 questions that you should be answering automatically by the time the flop hits the table. First question, does this board favor my range? Think about the cards that came out and ask whether your big blind defending range, which is wide and includes a lot of low pairs, suited hands, and connectors, connects with this texture better than a typical button opening range does. Draw-heavy boards, paired lobes, boards with specific connectivity that a wide calling range hits frequently. These are the boards where your range has structural advantages. If the answer is yes, the check raise is on the table as a strong option. Second question, what hands do I have here? Within the range that connects with this board, you need to identify the specific hand you're holding. Does it fall into one of the check raise categories? Strong draw, combo draw, top pair with backdoors, 2 pair on a specific texture? Or is it a hand that benefits more from pot control and calling down? This is not about having a rigid rule. It's about quickly categorizing where your specific hand sits relative to the board. Third question, how is this player betting? Have they been firing continuation bets at high frequency with a wide range? Are they the type who auto-bets the flop and needs to be challenged? Or are they a tighter player who only bets when they connect, meaning their continuation bets carry more strength? Against high-frequency bettors, check raises are more profitable because their betting range contains more folds. Against tight selective bettors, you need stronger hands and more careful timing. When all 3 answers align, the board favors your range, your hand falls into a check raise category, and the aggressor is betting at exploitable frequency. That is your moment. That's when you stop being the passive defender and start being the player who forces the decision. The mental shortcut. When a draw-heavy or connected board hits and the button auto-bets into a wide range, they are handing you an invitation to take control. Most players decline that invitation every single time and wonder why their big blind win rate is always negative. The players who accept it with discipline and appropriate hand selection are the ones who make this position genuinely profitable. But there's one more layer to this that separates the players who use check raises well from the players who use them at the highest level. And it comes down to a concept that most players don't connect to check raising at all. First, your poker is not about the number of hands you play. It's not about how many pots you're involved in, how often you open, how many continuation bets you fire. The players who win consistently over time are the ones who understand that every decision is a deployment of resources, chips, attention, position, timing, and that deploying those resources correctly, at the right moments, is the entire game. The check raise from the big blind is not a move you use constantly. It's not a reflex. It's not a habit. It's a weapon. And weapons are only effective when they're used with precision. When you know why you're using them, what outcome you're seeking, and what happens if the situation doesn't unfold the way you anticipated. This is the discipline side of the check raise that most strategy videos don't talk about. The emotional discipline to not check raise when you want to, because the board doesn't favor it, or the hand doesn't support it, or the player you're against doesn't have the continuation betting patterns that make it profitable. The patience to wait for the right moment. The confidence to execute with full commitment when that moment arrives. The big blind is a position that asks for discipline more than almost any other. You're going to be in it constantly. You're going to face aggression constantly. And the temptation to either fold too much or call too much is always there, because both of those feel safer than the check raise. Folding is clean, calling is low commitment. The check raise is a declaration. It requires you to take a position, accept the risk, and play through the consequences. But that declaration is exactly what makes the big blind a position you can profit from rather than just survive. Passive players survive their big blinds. Dangerous players exploit them. The check raise is the single most direct path from surviving to exploiting, not because it wins every pot, because it changes the entire conversation at the table. It tells every player watching that this position, this player, this hand is not going to just call and fold. It has to be respected. Build that reputation. Deploy this weapon correctly, at the right moments, with the right hands on the right boards, and you will start to notice something in the players who used to freely attack your big blind. They slow down. They check back more. They bet smaller, because they've learned, at some cost to them, that the automatic continuation bet into this specific player is not a free action anymore. That change in their behavior is equity. Invisible equity that shows up across hundreds of hands in ways that never appear in a single pot, but absolutely appear in the long-run results. If this video helped you see the big blind differently, as a position with real offensive potential, take 2 seconds and like the video. It genuinely helps the algorithm understand that this kind of serious poker education is what this audience wants, and it means more content like this gets made and reaches more players who are trying to build a real edge. Share it with someone in your poker circle who you think is leaving money on the table in this spot. Subscribe to Mind of a Grinder if you want to keep building this kind of strategic depth across every position and every situation in the game. The channel grows because serious players decide it's worth their support, and when it grows, the content gets better and reaches further. Now take what you learned today and bring it to the table. The flop is coming. Stop just checking. Start building weapons.